Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back. Today, we are straying away from our normal content currently. We're still going to focus on astrology, but rather than doing the seasonal transit updates or the new and full moons, I want to talk to you about some research I've been doing for the last 5, 6, 7 months or so, give or take. Considering we will have the North Node move into Aquarius this July, I believe it's July 26th, 2026. The North Node will move into Aquarius, what will join Pluto. So I was curious about what happened in history every time the North Node and Pluto came together. And these are my findings. So as always, I will have my notes right here. If you see me looking off to the side, that's where I'm looking. I might even bring them in front of me because we got a lot to go through right now, people, starting with some speculations of what we can potentially expect as the North Node transits into Aquarius, and then we'll just go backwards from there because the nodes are perpetually turning in a retrograde motion. Anyway, let's get to it. So even the day that the North Node shifts into Aquarius, again on July 26, 2026, we have a couple other Saturn-focused energies happening that day. We will have the Moon enter Capricorn at 9:44 in the morning, and then on that same day, Saturn stations retrograde to turn around at 3:56 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is prominent because in modern astrology, Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius. To start off this North Node transit, which is just about a year, maybe a year and a half long as it transits through Aquarius, Saturn turning around on the same day that the moon moves into a Saturn rulership, that the North Node is then moving into Aquarius, which is ruled by Saturn. There's a lot of long-term Saturnian energy that will be brought to the forefront. Now, with Saturn stationing retrograde on that same day, depending on how it is in your chart, it's going to be different if you have a natal retrograded Saturn in your chart compared to a regular, quote unquote, forward moving Saturn in your chart. The energy might evolve a bit differently, but in terms of collective awareness and understanding of what Saturn will represent for this, already Aquarius is a little bit wacky, it's a little bit eccentric, it does things on its own accord, but in doing things in its own accord, its own accord ends up benefiting the collective because there is a selfishness to it, but it's a selfishness that's in pursuit of, again, a beneficial energy to be brought to the whole. Because Aquarius is a humanitarian sign. It's a sign that it's the water bearer, right? And when we think of the water bearer, they don't drink the water that they are bearing. They are pouring into the cups of others. But in order to have the strength and the capability to be able to pour into the cups of others, they need to make sure that they themselves are firmly rooted in their strength and their own ability. But again, with Saturn turning around on the same day that the North Node moves into Aquarius, it gives me almost this reverse energy where we are typically thinking long term and into the future, but that retrograded energy usually brings us inward. And I believe Neptune will be retrograde at the same time in Aries, which will also be ruled indirectly by that Gemini Mars. And Mars is our planet of action. In Gemini, it's fast paced. But because Neptune and Saturn will then station retrograde just before this transit occurs, be expect the unexpected, especially with Uranus and Gemini having that partial rulership over it as well. Expect the unexpected, especially in terms of the ways that you believe you are meant to show up and be of service, both for yourself and for the collective as a whole. And with Saturn bringing us internally, especially because Saturn's focused on that long-term discipline, devotion to the version of yourself and the goals you set for yourself in the long term, Saturn's focused on that devotion and that discipline. And usually that means meeting external goals and expectations. But when it goes retrograde, those expectations are turned inward. So you might feel on this day a big shift in how you view yourself, how you are aligning or potentially not aligning to the goals that you have set for yourself, and especially how those goals that you have set not only benefit you, but benefit the whole, because that is the entire theme of Aquarius. So if you've been moving in a way that you know is really selfish for selfish's sake, rather than selfish for the sake of my own personal well-being, so I can show up more fully and wholeheartedly for the collective in service. If you know what you're doing, especially long term, is really for your own personal gain and fuck everybody else, this is going to be a transit that hopefully helps you realign to the importance of the ways in which we show up for others, the ways in which we show up for ourselves, not only just to show up for ourselves, but the ways that we show up for ourselves in order to show up for others. And just for Aquarius themes, I'm going to read off my notes that I wrote. I said innovation, technology, humanitarian efforts, individuality, which contributes to the collective action, brazen boldness, a desire to be different, and an emphasis on the ways that our differences make us so incredibly unique, which then subsequently connects us to the whole. Because I am individually me, and in that individual uniqueness, I see your individual uniqueness, and at the core of that individual uniqueness is that same spark of life. So while we are expressing that same spark of life differently than one another, ultimately at its core, we recognize that same spark of life. I have chills right now. You probably can't see it on this camera. I have chills right now because it's about the only way we can see each other truly is when we are anchored so fully and expressing and embodying that spark of life within us. That's how we see the other sparks in others, is when we embody that spark within ourselves. That's what Aquarius represents. And again, it's not individuality just so I can just say, fuck all, I'm going to go do my thing. It's individuality which encourages us to all tap into that uniqueness within us. Because when we are all tapped into our unique gifts, we can give those gifts back to the world in a way that will help the world grow and the collective thrive, and for all of us to come together in our unique beauty. And while I cannot predict the future, and I'll touch a little bit more on this when we get to the North Node and Pluto in Leo, while I can't predict the future based on the data, what I can speculate on is that as we move through this next year and a half to 2 years or so while the North Node transits Aquarius, what we can expect, especially when it gets closer to Pluto, is this unbecoming, this crumbling of the systems and the structures of the machine as the individual. We're already seeing the subtle hints of that since Pluto entered Aquarius in 2024. We've already seen the subtle hints of what has been established, the traditions that we've been following for a long time, crumbling. Because that's another part of Aquarius. It's innovation for the sake of growth and for collective becoming, right? If this tradition does not work, because Saturn is also tradition, but Saturn in Capricorn is more the traditions for tradition's sake, where Saturn in Aquarius says, we've been doing this for a long time, and my friends and I, we're not really liking this. This isn't working. Not only are we not liking this, it's not working for any of us. So why would we maintain a tradition that doesn't work? When we can either tweak the tradition to adjust the system to make it, again, beneficial for the whole, or say, fuck the tradition, because this tradition, it's unsalvageable. We're getting to that point where we're recognizing it's unsalvageable. So as the North Node transits through Aquarius, and again, as the North Node gets closer and closer to Pluto, which is transformation, it's destruction, it's death, it's rebirth, it's a new becoming, it's metamorphosis in that aspect. As the North Node gets closer and closer to Pluto throughout this transit, we will see more people coming into terms of their authentic expression, finding the gifts that they have within themselves, and following their joy, following that spark, that breath of life, especially having that dual rulership in the air signs. And while Uranus is in Gemini and Aquarius and Pluto and the North Node are in Aquarius, we also have Saturn and Neptune in Aries, which is not only a fire sign, but it's the first sign of the zodiac. It is a sign of sheer willpower, of just going after it because you know there's no choice within you. That there's not much patience when it comes to Aries energy, even with Saturn involved in that. Even with Neptune involved in that. Aries is still the youngest. It's the child of the zodiac that has bright eyes and big dreams and will stop at nothing to ram their head into it in order to go after it. I said ram, to bull, even because the ram is Taurus. But anyway, bull their heads through it. Oh no, I got that backwards. The ram is Aries and the bull is Taurus. So yes, we are ramming our heads into it just to see what will work. Because for Aries energy, it's better to try and fail than to not try at all. And so as we have this double air and double fire energy, triple air with the North Node especially, and again, because Aquarius or the North Node and Pluto in Aquarius will be ruled by either Uranus and Gemini, or that Saturn in Aries, which is ruled by our Gemini Mars at the beginning of this transit. There's a lot of necessity to just go and do it. And on top of that, Aquarius is the oldest air trickster of the zodiac, while Gemini is the youngest trickster, period, of the zodiac. So not only do we have this very forward-facing, go at it, sheer willpower energy, we also have a lot of trickster energy that is very rooted in the atmosphere. And how do I explain this? Trickster energy are shapeshifters. And the only way a shapeshifter can do their work successfully is if they know wholeheartedly who they actually are on the inside. Because a lot of trickster energies, a lot of shapeshifters, they will piss a lot of people off in pursuit of whatever it is that they're going after. Because they're tricksters. Because it's in pissing people off that they help people learn exactly where their faults may lie, or their weaknesses, or what they need to learn in order to progress. But the only way the trickster can do that successfully is if the trickster is not knocked over by the winds of judgment, of false perception, right? The trickster needs to know who they are. So not only are we entering Aquarius, which is the sign of individualism in order to benefit the collective, but again, it's that trickster energy and that sheer willpower. So there's going to be a lot of messiness on this transit or throughout this transit. But that messiness is going to help us discover the center, the stillness, the truth, and the flame within. So, again, to summarize what I believe we can expect as this transit through Aquarius occurs with Pluto and the North Node is a crumbling of the systems and the traditions that simply do not work for anybody anymore other than the top 0.00000000001%. That system is going to crumble because it's been built with a focus of the machine and the system as the individual. And all of the collectives of people that have been working their tails off in order to prop up this system, who have been stepped on and crushed and crumbled by the system, we're going to see massive revolts, which again, we've already seen with the warehouse fires, with the riots, with just people becoming more awakened and aware, even just in the last couple months. We're already seeing the very beginning of it. We're going to continue to see that, where people will just stop going to work. They will stop paying their bills. They will stop participating in the system that they know does not benefit anybody other than the people that are exploiting everybody. We're going to see a grand wave of people removing themselves from the system and finding and discovering joy outside of the system, going down the paths untrekked. They will not only find their joy and their fulfillment, but a stability that the system would have never allowed them to know. And then they're going to tell their friends, and they're going to tell their friends, and they're going to tell their friends. And it'll start underground, but it's going to be a mass movement. Oh, I have full body chills. A mass movement. Where just one by one, people are removing themselves silently. At least silent in the face of the system. And the people exploiting the collective, who only saw the system as the individual rather than the collective of people as individuals, they're not going to realize what's happened until they really feel it, where it matters most for them, which is in their pockets. Meanwhile, the collective, the people who are actually in touch with their humanity and are just on this earth trying to live a good, decent, happy life, we're going to find greater community, greater joy. We're going to be tapped more into our gifts of individuality and expression and art. And we're going to see more localized community gatherings amplifying. We're going to see more people who have been considered hermits for a very long time, kind of trapped in their hermit hole. Not trapped, but purposely staying in their hermit hole, emerging. And a lot of these hermits are going to be the ones that are leading the charge. And I'm excited to see it. And I have more speculation, but just for time's sake, because we're already pretty far into this, let's get into the themes of what we went through as the North Node and Pluto moved with each other throughout the zodiac. So, Pluto in 2008 to 2024 was in Capricorn, and then the North Node was with Pluto in Capricorn at the very beginning of that transit. So, uh, August 21st, 2020, I almost said 2029. We're not there yet. August 21st, 2009 until March 2nd of 2011 is when the North Node joined Pluto in Capricorn. And then that they had an exact conjunction on November 9th of 2010 at 3 degrees Capricorn. and Pluto entered Capricorn in January of 2008, which is the same year that the 2008 financial crisis took the world by storm. Mind you, I was 11, 12 at the time, so I didn't know any of that was happening while it was happening. I was worried about pillow pets and my dance classes, and that was about it. But I think it's very fascinating that we had the buildup and the peak of the financial crisis when Pluto first entered Capricorn, because Pluto is the destruction, it's the death, it's the transformation, and Capricorn again is about tradition. So it was a death to the tradition of the system that we've been existing in for a very long time, which obviously started not to work a long time before this. But then Pluto ripped the veil off of that and said, yeah, not only is this not working, we're at the peak and we got to do something about it fast or it's going to crash. And that's exactly what happened. It crashed. And then about a year and a half later, because again, Pluto entered Capricorn in January of 2008. Year and a half later, in August of 2009, that's when the North Node entered Capricorn. And just from the notes that I've taken, it was after the North Node entered Capricorn that the world finally had that first breath of like, you started to see countries all coming out of their recessions very slowly, little by little, and it took pretty much the entire transit of the North Node moving through Capricorn for the majority of the countries to find that relief and to find a positive GDP. You know, we're back in the green rather than being in the red or the black or whatever they call it there. But it was very fascinating to see that when Pluto first entered, that's when the destruction happened. And then when the North Node came in, which the North Node is our forward thinking, it's our long term goals, it's our destiny in that manner. It's how we align to our destiny in order to learn the lessons and become the people and the society that we are meant to become. The North Node gave that breath of life to the destruction that Pluto reaped. So Pluto was the destruction, but it's also the rebirth. But it needed to destroy itself completely in order to allow itself to be rebirthed with the help of the North Node. So, like I said, North Node entered. A bunch of countries start claiming that they're free of recession, or they have made it out of the recession, or they have at least an uptick in their GDP, their nation's currency, et cetera, et cetera. But on top of that, you know, with Capricorn, there's an emphasis on excellence. It's not just about the aesthetic nature of things and propping things up because they look good but don't actually have the talent or the willpower to back it up. Capricorn is about true excellence. And we saw a lot of that with a lot of records being broken in sports, in music, in arts and entertainment, in just personal like feats. You know, we saw a lot of that. And I'm just going to read off of the list of what I wrote here. Because again, emphasis on personal excellence and record breaking talents. We had Avatar premiere during that time, and it broke box office records worldwide and became the number one selling movie. I think still to this day, it's still at number one. Avatar. There were a lot of sports records broken, and I just put two as an example just because I had so many written down. We had Tom Brady break the record for most touchdown passes in one quarter, and a man named Jerry Salon became the first NBA coach to win 1,000 games with one single team. We love that. Excellence, personal excellence, and teamwork excellence too there. We had the Burj Khalifa, which is the world's tallest building, open in Dubai, breaking records there. Susan Boyle releases her album and breaks more world records worldwide, which again emphasized that propping and visibility of excellence and not just focusing on the aesthetics. When we see true talent, we're going to give that true talent a voice and a face and the ability to express itself. There was an Australian cooking competition called My Kitchen Rules, which premiered that day, and it ended up becoming the top rated Australian television program. That's one of the top rated or the top rated that's ever been in existence. And Capricorns, low key, Cancers and Taurus get the rep for being more foodie oriented. But when a Capricorn truly loves you, they will cook for you, and they are some of the best cooks that you will ever eat with. Eat under. You know what I mean. But I thought that was just a fascinating thing too. Angry Birds is released, one of the most popular games ever created. Africa's tallest monument, the African Renaissance Monument, was dedicated in Senegal to commemorate Senegal's 50th anniversary of independence. And again, Africa's tallest monument was built then. Jessica Watson, a 16-year-old, became the youngest person to sail solo, nonstop, and unassisted around the entire world, which I think, again, pure excellence. And at 16 years old, as a woman, love that one. Archaeologists announced the discovery of the oldest tomb in Mesoamerica, containing the remains of a 50-year-old man. And the last one I have on this list is music focused. So we had One Direction formed, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, and Nicki Minaj's album Pink Friday, both released on the same day. Adele's Rolling the Deep is released 1 week later and climbs to number one. And then I think a couple months later, her next album was released after that and also broke records. So again, lots of record breaking, lots of propping up of excellence, which Capricorn, again, it's all about the work ethic and it's all about proving the excellence. It's not just looking like you do, it's proving it. And I think all of those things were perfect examples of that. But at the same time, because Capricorn represents traditions, we also had a lot of tensions between old traditional values and new traditional norms being established. So there was one part where I think it was in Seattle. Let me look at my notes. In Portland. So there was a police officer named James Crocker. He was asked to leave the Red and Black Cafe in Portland after a co-owner claimed that his uniformed presence made him uncomfortable. And that I think was a big shift in the way that we view police presence as like a society as a whole, right? Because up till fairly recently, police had had a general, depending on which demographic you ask, mind you, mind you, but especially in places like Portland, in predominantly white areas, police officers weren't looked at with such harsh or negative connotations, right? So the traditional view of police officers, again, for people who look like me, because I understand there's differences culturally here, but for people who look like me, for the most part, police officers were looked at as dignified professions, as people who were here to protect and serve, because social media barely existed at this point too, so we didn't have as much evidence of the police being as brutal as they were. Now, I was raised in a family that did not trust police, so it's not really my truth. But again, this sparked that conversation of traditional views and understandings of the collective shifting in favor of the collective rather than just the uniformed presence that is supposed to protect and serve. Again, the difference between the aesthetics of the truth versus the truth. Going along with that, I just said social media barely existed. Instagram was launched very shortly after that interaction there. So, again, new traditional values in terms of how we show up online and create online communities and express ourselves online too. That was newly formed. Disney acquired Marvel, which combined two massive powerhouses in terms of arts and entertainment and movies. We had Carl Jung's Red Book published, which contained personal notes on his subconscious while he was developing his theories. And if you have ever read any of Carl Jung's information, especially how he speaks on what he was moving through subconsciously as he was going through his research and his works, it gets dark and deep and taboo. It gets dark and deep and taboo and goes against, again, a lot of traditional ways that we were supposed to think and feel as he was moving through the world. We also had Tiger Woods quit golf to focus on his marriage after public backlash due to his affairs. And again, this is an outward appearance of trying to maintain appearances of like that traditional family value structure, but ultimately we know that ended in divorce. But again, at the time, he was trying to maintain that appearance. So I counted that as part of that Capricorn understanding. We had California's Proposition 8, which was an initiative to ban same sex marriage after Obama passed it. It was passed by voters in 2008, but then overturned by a judge in Perry versus Schwarzenegger. So again, it's that tension between old traditional values and new traditions that are being established in society. Tension between the two. And again, it's fascinating that it was passed by voters, which is showing that, like, collectively, there were people that still wanted to maintain that traditional value versus the people who were ready to allow things to bloom and merge and evolve with the times. And then finally, the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy is signed into law by Obama. Shout out. Heck yeah. There was also a lot of massive natural disasters that broke a lot of records in terms of rainfall, snowfall, like earthquakes, deaths from a lot of these natural disasters too. So again, it's not only breaking records in excellence and expression in arts, but also breaking records in calamity that we're seeing here. There was also a lot of civil unrest worldwide. We had purposeful bombings, revolutions, mass shootings, assassination attempts, and also accidental explosions of various plants, nuclear plants, gas plants, oil plant, like a lot of random like explosions happening there. But also explosions metaphorically and literally due to civil unrest, which again is that aspect of justice which Capricorn and Saturn represents. And speaking of justice, we had justice finally being served for crimes committed in the past. There was this one's funny. There was the director of Die Hard was sentenced to a year in prison for lying to the FBI. Caught up with him, apparently. And there was also a man named Andrew Wakefield, who was a doctor at the center of the MMR vaccination scare. He was fined heavily and lost his and struck out of the medical register, lost his license, all of that because he was found guilty of serious professional misconduct. But this is years after it had all actually occurred that he was finally facing his justice, which again, not only is the justice aspects attorney in that aspect, but also the longevity of that, because maybe he thought he was getting off scot free, but Saturn said, not quite, not quite. Here's your sentence. And the last one I have for Capricorn, is that reparations were finally being paid and recognized for past racial injustices. And the main one I wrote for this one was that the Civil Rights Center and Museum opens in Greensboro on the same site as the first nonviolent lunch counter sit-in protest against segregation. And funny enough, that one actually occurred while Virgo, or while the North Node and Pluto were in Virgo, which we will get to as we continue on. So that was Capricorn. Let's move on to Scorpio. A blue jay just ran into my window. Okay. Like I said, there was never a point where Pluto and the North Node were in Sagittarius together. And when we get to Scorpio, Pluto and the North Node joined together to conjoin one another only 20 days after the North Node entered Scorpio, because Pluto was there from 1983 to 1995, and then the North Node joined in 1994. So they pretty much both exited Scorpio, or I guess I should say Pluto exited Scorpio at the same time that the North Node was still transiting through. But a lot of the themes of this Scorpio transit was centered around escapism and taboo and secrets. Whoa, excuse me, substance abuse. There were trials for stalking and domestic violence, like multiple times throughout the notes that I've taken. And just a lot of really shady stuff going on that was thinly veiled as like necessities, or like the shady stuff was hidden under a blanket of like, just for the greater good kind of thing. What did I write here? Like there was a US fighter jet that accidentally shot down two US helicopters over Iraq, excuse me, and just the details around that were a little bit, I said, sure, Jan, sure, Jan. Um, and a lot of energy surrounding firearms in the month of February, which is again when the North Node finally entered Scorpio, because the North Node entered Scorpio on February 2nd, 2294, and then the exact conjunction was the 22nd, February 22nd of 1994, at 28 degrees Scorpio. And the energy of the firearms and like mass shootings and just gun violence in general, especially in the 90s where it wasn't as prominent as we're seeing today, that energy seems very Martian to me. But the more, quote, because I don't like using this word, but the more unevolved Martian energy that we would see of people just acting out of sheer willpower without any thought, with and acting out of sheer emotion, like crimes of passion, you know. But that in itself seemed very Martian, of just like people acting out and promoting violence just because they are feeling so intensely. But again, with the conjunction happening in February, it does make a lot of sense there. There was also a ton of records broken at the Winter Olympics, which I guess, in terms of how this relates, Pluto partially rules Scorpio in modern rulership, which is again death and rebirth. So it's death of the old and the rebirth of the new, I guess is what you could say to that. Oh, and this was one of my favorite things about this transit too, which I guess the only way I can explain this is that it was so ridiculous that it leaned almost taboo. But there were a ton of records being broken for like the largest food ever created, right? So there was the largest milkshake, the largest omelet, the largest lollipop, the largest popcorn bucket filled with popcorn, the longest sausage ever. And again, it leans so far into that absurdity, which then leans into the taboo that Scorpio usually represents. But these were all happening worldwide too. I know one was in Canada, one was in, I think two were in the US, one was in Jacksonville, Florida. I think it was the popcorn bucket. One was in Africa. Like all over the world, people were just doing stuff for no good reason, just to see what was possible. And you know what? Shout out to them. I appreciate that. And it's almost like going against the status quo of the normal by saying, like, yeah, we could eat popcorn. But what if it was like a swimming pool's worth of popcorn? Whatever, sure. Why not? Why not? And going along with that, there was also a lot of pushing the absolute limits of human potential, which again is very Scorpionic, Plutonian themed, of going so far to see just how far you can go before you reach that breaking point, right? And the example I have for this one is there was a man who became the first person to reach on foot the North Pole, the South Pole, and the summit of Everest. But there was another man that went on the first solo and unsupported trip to the North Pole, and then a 16-year-old did the youngest unsupported solo sail. So again, just pushing yourself past your limits just to see how far you can go. That in itself is very scorpionic. And again, so much war and death and strategy and tragedy. There were broken promises to end wars, peace treaties that weren't kept. Moving along with that, just for the sake of time, there was a notable rise in socialist, democratic socialist, and communist election wins, not only in America, in Europe too, in Canada. Lots of candidates that were running that were openly democratically socialist or just plain old socialist, but they were like, but I'll work within the system, but this is what I believe. They were all elected. And when I think of socialism, I think of like the punk movement and I think of the alternative movement and the people that started on the fringes of society, made their own communities, and then found that the way that they are running their communities on the fringes of society actually works to benefit society. So I think that's how that ties into that scorpionic theme, because to me, Scorpio energy is very punk in itself. And I mean that as the greatest compliment. Shout out to the punk movement. Rock the fuck on, okay? Shout out there. But I think that's where it ties into the Scorpio, like anti establishment kind of energy. Oh, and talk about like random hidden details coming to light because Scorpios like to keep things hidden. There was a random chemical fire in an apartment complex that ended up revealing the plans for a massive terrorist attack in America. No secrets. No secrets. And of course, there were a lot of changing of hands of ownership and monopolizing of the popular TV stations, which again, shady business, which ended up causing a lot of issues that we're seeing today, including not being told the real news and having every news station, no matter which side it's on, telling us the same thing, just with slightly different things to make sure the audience pays attention. Again, strategy. That's all scorpionic there. And then the last one I had written down for this was there was an increase in typically taboo innovations. And my favorite one of these is there was an all male cast of Swan Lake that premiered on a large stage, which ended up getting a pretty large audience. And even for the 90s was more progressive leaning in terms of where it saw America and the world as a future going, or the going in the future, I should say. But even still, there was a sense of sticking to the norms and the status quo that I think was still very prominent in the 90s. So something like that is pretty cool to see that people were open and willing to be like, oh, you know what, let's go see what this is about. And that was Scorpio. So let's move on to Libra. So Pluto was in Libra from 1971 to 1984. The North Node from June 8th, 1977. That's my grandmom's birthday. Not the day she was born. My mom was 3 that year. Anyway, June 8th, 1977 to July 5th of 1978, and it's stationed exact in that conjunction on Halloween of 1977 at 15 degrees Libra. We saw a lot of similar themes of excellence being pursued, but excellence not just in terms of aesthetics, but excellence sake, but because it's also in Libra and Libra is ruled by Venus, and there is that amplification of the aesthetic beauty coming forward. We also saw a lot of that. But at the same time, with Saturn and the scales of justice being the symbol for Libra, we also saw a lot of justice being served or being revealed to then eventually be served later down the line. So let's get into it. So just 1 week into the transit, there was already worldwide a lot of random and political diplomatic happenings, changing of hands and meetings with heads of houses or heads of states, whatever. But we also had the official formation of the Israeli government. And that's when we also saw a lot of the initial rumblings of the Israeli Palestine conflict begin to arise. Yeah. It was, I think that was the heaviest part of this research is just seeing how far back it goes. And to this day, how its justice has still not been served. We have to trust it will be. Anyway, moving on. Massive justice centered hearings and exposing, including the CIA finally released documents for the first time ever to show that they had, in fact, contributed in a mind controlling experiment of MK Ultra, where the justice coming to light showed us just how much we cannot truly trust our government. How about that, kids? How about that? The scales of justice eventually do lean one way or the other. Hopefully to come back into balance soon. Anyway, it was also the first photo of the Earth and the Moon taken together from space, which I just thought, again, looking at it from aesthetic standpoints, It reminded me of like people like hard launching their relationship on social media for the first time, like the Earth and her moon. I just love that together, and it seemed very Libran in that aspect of just like having that visual, that picturesque aesthetic of the two together. And of course, Libra is also about union. The Earth and the moon are in perpetual union with one another, which I just think is so cute. And also going along with that, we had groundbreaking musical debuts throughout the entire transit, but the two that I wrote down here were Rumors by Fleetwood Mac was released and stayed at number one for 5 months. 5 months it stayed at number one, and even after it moved off of number one, it was still at the top of the charts. Still top in the charts for a long time. And then the Talking Heads also debuted too, which again, excellence. Excellence in itself. And going back to the idea of unions and Libra representing love and Venus and all of that, there was a show called Love Boat, which premiered during this transit. And also, there was an emphasis on bringing equality and equity into the collective, not only just behind the scenes, but in a way where it was very visible and seen. So, I guess part of that could be the emphasis of the aesthetics rather than the actual justice of it. But I think it got the conversation going, which led to more widespread acceptance of equality for all people, all races, all religions, all creeds, all sexual orientations, even. And I'm just going to read off of the list of some of the ones that I wrote down here. We had the first woman to ref a heavyweight championship. The first woman astronauts were hired by NASA. Hurricanes were no longer just named after women. Thank God, right? We had the first six all women's basketball teams formed. The first openly gay man and the first black man were elected into their roles during the same election run. We even had the Mormons strike down a 148-year policy which excluded black men from priesthood, and then subsequently the first black Mormon priest was hired, put into position. I don't know. I don't know what the term would be. Sworn in. Who knows? You know what I'm trying to say. And finally, the first use of the rainbow flag. Fuck yeah. Yeah, you're right. Let's do it, baby. We had the Nobel Prizes and medals of honors were Nobel Prizes and medals of honor were presented to people who were working to bring peace and equality to the people and for aiding the progress towards greater connection through communication and entertainment technology. Now, I'm sure I had specifics written for that one. I didn't add them to the notes though. Sorry, people. And this is like 75 pages long, so it would take me a very long time to find the specifics. But we'll just go on with that. Prizes for people who are supporting the people. All of the people. Amen, sister. Let's keep going. And I have a lot more notes for this one, but the last one I'm going to say here is there were a lot of firsts for the arts that would end up going on to become like mega worldwide sensations, and renowned classics as a whole. We had the first Garfield comic strip, Grease, premiered at like the movie Grease, not just the musical, which is funny because just the other day I sang the entire album just in my kitchen, not even listening to the music. I was just singing, starting with Frankie Valli. Just singing it straight through. Oh my God. We also had the first White House Jazz Festival, which ended up becoming a like a regular annual thing. So that's pretty cool. But again, just for sake of time, because this is going way longer than I meant it to, story of my life, let's move on to Virgo. We've got Pluto in Virgo from 1957 to 1971, and the North Node joined up December 16th of 1959 to June 10th of 1961, stationing exact on New Year's Eve, December 31st on 1960 at 8 degrees Virgo. And starting off strong, the very first day that the North Node moved in to join Pluto in Virgo, there was a massive, brutal snowfall in Pakistan that ended up killing 48 people. And I wrote that it gave me the energy of like when Persephone was taken into the underworld and Demeter was pissed off and she caused a drought. She caused made sure none of the food could grow. That's what that energy gave me. And Virgo is Demeter and Persephone all in one when it comes to the deity connotations of what the goddesses represent in the zodiac. So I just thought that was fascinating that on the very first day we had that massive snowfall. And of course, with Virgo being ruled by Mercury, there was an emphasis throughout the entire transit of utilizing our voices and amplifying communication in order to find more equality and togetherness with the people. So a couple of the ones that I wrote on my notes here was the British Prime Minister was speaking out against apartheid in South Africa, which up until that point, most of the world heads really weren't saying anything openly about what was going on in South Africa there. And him speaking out brought more attention to it and more light to what was happening there. And of course, unfortunately, it didn't end for a long time after that. But every voice counts and every voice matters just to spread the awareness there. Going along with that, the USSR consulate was speaking out in support for Indonesia because Indonesia was going through its own revolution at the time. Now, in terms of morality, I don't know if it was a good thing that he was speaking out or against it. I don't know the history behind that one, but again, Russia speaking out for a country like Indonesia seems out of left field. So again, using the voice for things that matter. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of the civil rights protests, specifically the nonviolent protests that were happening while the North Node and Pluto were in Virgo together. And Virgo in itself representing the divine mother, the virgin, and also again, the harvest, Demeter, and peace, ease, collective togetherness, because the harvest is also the feast, which brings people together, right? And so we had the civil rights protest, including Woolworths, which I mentioned in whichever of the other one that was, maybe it was Scorpio. And I said it is fascinating that they were waiting to be served food and it was a peaceful protest, which together again, the harvest and the feast is very Virgo. The peace aspect of it is very Virgo. I know Libra gets the credit for being the peacekeeper, and I'm not saying that Virgos can't throw down when absolutely necessary, because you do not want to see a Virgo scorned. A Virgo that's dealing with their own injustices. Holy shit. They get scary real quick, and I respect the hell out of it. But for the most part, they want to maintain peace. They want to make sure everybody feels welcome and involved and together. That's what Virgos do. And so Woolworths being one of the figurehead movements of this whole entire transit just seemed very on the nose to me. There was also ancient handwriting found near the Dead Sea that had never been discovered before. It was since after that translated, but it emphasized that mercurial communication aspect that Virgo is ruled by. So I thought that was pretty cool. This one's funny. There was even a little slutty book called Lady Chatlery's Lover, written by D.H. Lawrence, that was banned for being obscene, but eventually that ban was overturned, which amplifies again the importance of recognizing all forms of written and spoken word, all forms of expression in that manner. And also, if you know, you know, Virgos are they're freaks when they feel safe and comfortable and open enough to express that side of themselves. So I just thought that in itself, again, was a little bit on the nose for this transit. And moving towards the idea of honoring the land and the people, because you cannot have a successful, fruitful harvest without honoring the land that the harvest had sprouted from and the spirits of that land, especially the indigenous spirits. The First Nations people of Canada were officially allowed to vote without having to change their legal status from their indigenous party, or their indigenous identity, excuse me, which shouldn't have ever been a thing, but you know what? At least it's progress where progress can be made. And again, it's just honoring the land and its people and the indigenous spirits and traditions of that land. A lot of first TV broadcasts, which again just emphasizes that communication and sharing that communication more widely. Adding baseball players' names to their jerseys became normalized when this trend was happening, which again is just identity expression, which is mercurial in its own aspect. There was the first completely underwater circumnavigation of the world, which reminded me of how Hermes is a psychopath, which he can shift between dimensions and worlds and universes and the underworld and the outer world with ease. He's the only deity that can go to the underworld and come back without really any hitch. And if you think about how the ocean is kind of another dimension in itself. So again, that just gave me very much Hermie vibes in that aspect. Yeah, the country Turkey required self-employed people to have a rest day for themselves by law, which again I thought was very Virgo in itself, because Capricorns and Virgos together, they are both workaholics. And Virgos, especially when they love what they do, they will work until they're blue in the face. They will work until they literally cannot stand up on their own 2 feet anymore. So it feels funny to me that the law had to step in while we had all this Virgo energy and be like, you, including self employed people, you by law need to take a break. Slow the fuck down. Take a rest day. Jesus Christ. I just thought that's so fucking funny. Oh, and the birth control pill was made legal and available in the US for the first time, which emphasizes rights of women that were exclusively for the benefit of women, which again gives me very much Demeter goddess vibes. It's not for the men, it's not for the system. This is for us. Virgo. Virgos will fight for women. Virgos will be an example of how women can fight for themselves as they fight for women. And I'm not saying other signs can't do that, but some of the strongest women leaders that I know personally, and just looking at them from a distance, Virgo placements. Look it up. Oh, and the last two I'll say for this one. It was the first time that we were ever able to synthesize chlorophyll. So it's Virgo in terms of both the advancement of the earth and of science together. And then the Agricultural Hall of Fame is formed during this transit too, which again, the harvest, the feast, Demeter, Persephone. You cannot make this up. Like it's the writing is on the wall. Hit the nail on the head. Hit the nose on the nail. Nail on the head. Is that the phrase? That's violent. I'm gonna change that phrase. But anyway, now let's get into Pluto. Oh God. But anyway, now let's get into Leo. This was, out of all the notes I took, this one took the longest to actually get through because start to finish, it was World War II. A lot of really heavy stuff. A lot of really heavy stuff. And I'm not going to get into the logistics of it. I'm going to, obviously, a lot of it was just war stuff. And my first note that I made was I've made it almost all the way through and I haven't added any of these notes to like my shortened notes because it's for the most part all just about the war. Battles and food rationing and the likes. And as I mentioned earlier, it was the system treating the system as the individual because Leo is all about individuality in terms of like, I'm going to shine so brightly and inspire others to do the same. So, where Aquarius is like, I'm not going to shine necessarily, I'm going to anchor into my truth and my personal expression. And it's in that anchoring that I am able to allow the spark within me to naturally shine out so that maybe most of the people think I'm a fucking freak ass weirdo, but the ones who have also tapped into their spark internally will be able to see their spark. Aquarius is like an authenticity that cannot be seen by anybody unless they have also tapped into that authenticity within themselves. Leo, I think, sometimes overcompensates. Leo can be deeply insecure, and in that insecurity, Leo will overcompensate and shine and be bubbly and boisterous and expressive and loud, and the center of attention, like very openly. So you will see Leo, but ultimately, a lot of times, it's a false spark or it's a false expression. And I'm not saying Leos are fake. I just think Leo placements have a very hard time feeling secure in themselves. And because they have a difficult time feeling secure in themselves, they like to project outwardly that confidence, that boisterousness, that loudness, because they know how it feels to be so deeply insecure and disconnected from themselves. So they want to express themselves as openly and as boldly as possible to help other people feel that they don't need to feel insecure within themselves. So it's like they approach it very differently, but ultimately the impact on others when it's expressed properly is the same between Leo and Aquarius, right? But where Aquarius betters themselves so they can tap into their gifts to help better the collective, Leo, it's a focus on bettering themselves so that other people can look at me in order to better themselves. So it's a little bit backwards in that. And when we look at Leo as an energy expressed collectively, especially again with the war at the peak here. So Pluto entered Leo in 1939, which is exactly when World War II started officially. It stayed there until 1957. The North Node was in Leo from November 22nd of 1942, the peak of the the peak of the war, I would say, until May 11th, 1944, which was just about a year out of the official ending of the war. But it's fascinating to me that Pluto entered Leo right at the very start. And I think it was because, similar to how when Capricorn or when Pluto entered Capricorn, we saw the combustion of the financial crisis, we needed Pluto to enter it first so that what was happening could become very visible. Because again, Leo is the sun, Leo is visibility. We needed that to, I'm not saying we needed a war. I got to be really careful with my words because people on the internet love to misconstrue what other people are saying. It's not what I'm saying. We did not need that war. We did not need that war. But I think the way that the system had been set up until that point emphasized just how disconnected from each other we actually are and how much the machine was acting as the individual, which again, like I mentioned earlier, which helped to prop up, or the individuals of the collective propped up the individual of the machine, where the machine was seen as the individual and the people were seen as just like oil to fuel that machine. And the only people that benefited from this war were the people that were at the top of it, were unaffected by it in terms of their own humanity. And the way that our system and our country and our world honestly is set up now, a lot of it was established by people born in the Pluto and Leo generation. And I posted a couple videos about this on TikTok. Radius of Aurora, go check that out under my astrology playlist. But that's part of the reason why the system is going to crumble, I'm assuming, while Pluto is in Aquarius. And we're going to see a lot of the tidings begin to officially turn while the North Node moves through Aquarius. Because the people who established it were born into war. And that's all subconsciously they know. It's this expression of fear. It's this rationing. It's this disconnect. It's racism. It's propaganda. It's hard to see truth behind a cloud of smoke. It's hard to know truth behind atom bombs and surprise attacks. So the people that are still running this nation, the people who have built this nation, built it on fear and with the idea that the system itself is the individual. And if we can keep the system strong, it'll trickle down into the individuals, which is not the truth. It's exploitation at its finest. So again, I don't want to get into the exact details of the war itself, but I do want to mention a couple of the notes that also happened while the war was going on, because I think some of them are very important. So this was during the war efforts. It was when the CIA was officially able to get a censorship deal with Hollywood, through using war efforts and the fight against propaganda to then infiltrate Hollywood to promote their own propaganda. And even today, I don't know if you guys are privy to this, but even today, movies are not allowed to be released without going through that subsection of the CIA. At least not wide scale, I should say. There is a branch of the CIA which requires all movies that are released globally, or I guess I should say in America at least, I don't know if it's globally, all movies that are made and produced in America and released in America need to be approved by the CIA. It started during this Pluto and Leo, and the North Node and Leo generation. And a little glimmer of sunshine in all of this darkness, we had Dr. Albert Hoffman discover the effects of LSD and therefore promote and create Bicycle Day. So again, it's fascinating that I just mentioned during Libra that that was when the truth about MK Ultra came out, and it started with such hope, especially with Dr. Albert Hoffman, brilliant man. Look him up if you don't know about him, but it started with such hope and joy and the ways that we can utilize this to better humanity. And of course, the US government, the Pluto and Leo generation grew up and decided to be nefarious with those findings. So we're just going to continue. We don't need to say that one. The first antibiotic remedy for tuberculosis is isolated by researchers in New Jersey. This one is the epitome of Leo energy to me. The very first Batman and Robin comic strip debuts in the US, and the very first Marvel movie is released, and guess what it is? Captain America. Both of them so Leo energy, if you ask me. And I'm actually just going to read exactly the notes I wrote, because again, sometimes I write better than I can speak. Um, in the tumult of the war and an amplification of hopelessness in the face of vile, violent evil, of course, the world would imagine a billionaire what am I saying? Pissed? Philanthropist, I guess that's how you say it. Anyway, who cosplays as a vigilante. This is every Leo's dream, to live a double life as a crime fighting superhero, although I feel as though most Leos would want the accolades, but who am I to say for certain? And then again, we also had Captain America, which again, it's shine, that superhero of big hope, and we're gonna save the world and be awesome and radical and just be strong and mighty, and very Leo. Especially in the face of uncertainty and destruction and death and collapse of what society was up until that point. Leave it to Leo energy to create and become the superheroes that they all need to save the day. On the nose. On the nose. Oh, and this one was funny to me because I'm a Philadelphia native. Go Birds. The owner of the Phillies at the time, William D. Cox, was permanently banned from baseball for having bet on his own team to win. I said this is so Leo because it brings to mind the meme where someone printed out a poster and it was just a picture of themselves. And at the top it says, "Have you seen this person?" And then at the bottom it says, "Well, now you have. Have a great day." It's just funny to me. And it also didn't make sense to me that he would be permanently banned for betting that his team would win. Seems backwards, but also that confidence, that's so Leo confidence. Let's be real here. And I didn't write any specifics with this note, but I said I do appreciate that despite the war efforts, the art still had a very necessary place in film and theater, music, and comedy, which of course is Leo in nature, the desire to entertain and promote beauty even in the face of darkness. But also, were quite a few movie stars who ended up getting drafted or volunteered for the war efforts, which were leading the infantry to bomb Berlin, which again is so Leo because they won these awards as movie stars, and then they're like, you know what? This award is not enough. We need to go save the world. Cue the Captain America theme song. Oh my gosh. There were also three volcanic. This is fascinating to me when I learned it. There were three volcanic eruptions, with two being in the heat of the unrest and battle at Mount Etna and Vesuvius in Italy. And there was another newer volcano, I believe in Mexico. Yeah, Mount Paracutin. Definitely didn't pronounce that right. But that erupted on a farmer's land. But the other two erupted again during battle in Italy, two different locations during battle. Which again, volcanoes, fire, heat, all seems like the sun is just a big ball of lava fire in the sky, and the sun rules Leo. So I know it's kind of a stretch, but that seemed to me like Mother Nature getting involved during, like, in the way she knew how to amplify, like, hey, we should not be fucking fighting and destroying our natural resources here. Can't we all just get along? And if not, we're sending fire. Period. Period. Oh my gosh. And then the last note I had on this was there was 2,500 women. I guess it was only women because the men were all at war. But they trampled, stampeded, and trampled guards and workers while they were trying to buy 1,500 alarm clocks at a department store. And I said, the only way that I can get this to connect to Leo, other than like the general tension and upheaval of the energy that was surrounding everybody at the time, the only way that I think it really connects to Leo is because Leo is considered the masculine, right? And when we think of the masculine, we think patriarchy. When we think patriarchy, we think of that established time. We think of the 5 day work week. We think of the system as we know it. We think of the dineural time where it's like 12 hours a day, 12 hours a night, blah, 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 blah. So that's the way I kind of connected it with Leo there, was like that binaural cycle, and alarm clocks wake us up unnaturally against our body's will, against the will of the sun and natural daylight. Um, so in order to promote and maintain the system as it is. So that was the only thing I could connect in that sense. But again, other than the war, which obviously was the majority of what we were moving through collectively worldwide, there were still glimmers of hope and sunshine that were focused on truth and positivity and light in that way. So, again, my main focus here is looking at the ways that the Leo and Pluto generation created this system and the ways that now this Pluto and Aquarius time frame is going to destroy and revamp the system to make it work for the all, not just for the system and not just for the small, being the small percentage of people at the top. Oh my gosh. And that's all I got. Those are all my notes. Well, those aren't all my notes. Again, I took like 75 pages of notes, but fascinating stuff. Very fascinating stuff. And again, while I can't predict the future of what we're going to see while Pluto in the North Node transit Aquarius, I do have faith that we are going to see of how a reckoning of how the system has pushed us down for far too long and how the collective will rise from the ashes of what is purposely being left behind. So if you're nervous, if you're scared, just remember that things must be destroyed before we can rebuild. But the rebuilding is going to benefit the whole. You need to believe. You need to believe. They've already lost. We're on our way to a collective reclamation. Trust in it. Trust in it. But anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. You guys rock. This research has been so fun, but also heavy at times, and I'm grateful to have been able to share it and provide the information here. Again, if you made it this far, I love you. Thank you. And let me know what you think about What's to come, what has been, anything else, because hey, we already win. Booyah. All right, I gotta go. I love you. Thanks for listening. And it's 1:44 as I finish this. Love that. Okay, that's it. Love you all. Bye.